It was the summer of 2005 when James and his family decided to move into an old farmhouse on the outskirts of a small town. The house, though beautiful and surrounded by acres of land, had been abandoned for years. Locals often whispered about strange occurrences, but James and his wife shrugged it off as silly rumors. Their two young children, Emily and Michael, were excited about their new home. The first few nights were peaceful. But one evening, as James sat reading in the living room, he heard soft footsteps above him. Thinking it was the kids, he called out to them, but there was no response. He climbed the creaky stairs, expecting to find them playing, but both were sound asleep in their rooms. The next morning, he mentioned the footsteps to his wife, Lisa. She looked concerned but told him it was probably just the house settling. But that night, the footsteps returned, louder this time, as if someone was pacing back and forth upstairs. James went to investigate again, but just like the night before, the kids were fast asleep. Days passed, and the strange noises became more frequent. Footsteps, whispers, and sometimes the faint sound of laughter echoed through the halls. One evening, while James was working late, Lisa heard a soft knock on their bedroom door. She opened it to find no one there, but as she closed the door, she saw it, a shadow, darting across the hallway. Terrified, Lisa ran to the children's room, only to find them both sitting up in bed, wide-eyed. "Mom, there's a man in the house," Emily whispered. Lisa's heart raced as she checked every corner, but the house was empty. That night, they all slept in the same room, too scared to be apart. The next day, James called a local historian to ask about the house's past. What he learned chilled him to the bone. In the early 1900s, a man named Charles had lived in the farmhouse with his family. One night, in a fit of rage, Charles had murdered his wife and children before taking his own life. Since then, the house had a reputation for being haunted. Determined to protect his family, James brought in a priest to bless the house. For a while, the activity stopped, and the family began to feel safe again. But one evening, as they sat down for dinner, the lights flickered, and a cold gust of wind blew through the house. The whispers returned, louder than ever, and this time, they were coming from the walls. The children screamed as the shadowy figure of a man appeared in the doorway. James stood frozen in place, his heart pounding, as the figure moved closer. In a desperate attempt to protect his family, James grabbed a crucifix and shouted for the spirit to leave. The figure paused, its shadowy form flickering, before vanishing into thin air. That night, they packed their bags and left the house for good. Moral: some places hold the echoes of past horrors. No matter how much we try to ignore the history of a place, the truth has a way of revealing itself. Always be cautious when moving into a home with a dark past, for some spirits are not ready to let go. On a cold winter night in 1998, Jake was driving home from a party. The roads were icy, and the snowstorm made visibility nearly impossible. He was about 30 minutes from home when he spotted a young woman on the side of the road, waving for a ride. She was dressed in a light jacket, clearly not suited for the freezing weather. Feeling sorry for her, Jake pulled over and offered her a ride. The woman thanked him and climbed into the passenger seat, shivering. As they drove, Jake tried to make conversation, but the woman was quiet, her gaze fixed on the road ahead. There was something off about her, but Jake couldn't quite put his finger on it. After a few minutes, she finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Can you drop me off at the cemetery up ahead?" Jake felt a chill run down his spine. It was an odd request, but he didn't want to argue. As they approached the cemetery, the woman pointed to a spot near the entrance. "Right here," she said softly. Jake pulled over, but when he turned to look at her, the passenger seat was empty. The woman had vanished. Terrified, Jake scrambled out of the car and looked around, but there were no footprints in the snow. Confused and shaken, he drove home as quickly as possible, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The next day, Jake returned to the cemetery, hoping to find some answers. As he walked among the gravestones, he came across a small memorial near the entrance. The photograph on the headstone stopped him in his tracks. It was the woman from the night before. According to the inscription, she had died in a car accident on that very road 10 years earlier. Jake couldn't believe what he was seeing. He had given a ride to a ghost. Moral: sometimes, the spirits of those who passed tragically continue to wander the places they once knew. Not all encounters with the supernatural are malevolent, but they remind us that the veil between life and death is thinner than we think. In 2011, a couple named David and Jenna moved into an old Victorian house in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The house was filled with antique furniture, and in one of the upstairs bedrooms, they found an old porcelain doll sitting on a chair. Its eyes were large and glassy, its face cracked with age. Jenna thought the doll was creepy, but David found it fascinating and insisted on keeping it. They placed it on a shelf in the living room, thinking nothing of it. But strange things began happening almost immediately. At night, Jenna would hear faint giggles coming from the living room. When she'd check, the room would be empty, but the doll would be sitting in a different position. One morning, Jenna woke up to find the doll on the floor, its glassy eyes staring up at her. She was sure she had left it on the shelf the night before. David brushed it off, saying it must have fallen during the night, but Jenna couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As the days went on, the disturbances became more frequent. Lights would flicker, doors would slam on their own, and at night, they'd hear soft footsteps coming from the hallway. Jenna was convinced the doll was behind it, but David refused to believe her. One evening, while David was at work, Jenna decided she had had enough. She grabbed the doll and threw it into the trash outside, feeling a sense of relief. But later that night, when David returned home, he found the doll sitting back on the shelf, as if it had never left. Jenna was horrified and told David what she had done. Realizing that something was truly wrong, they decided to research the house's history. What they discovered was chilling. The house had once belonged to a woman named Margaret, who was obsessed with collecting dolls. She had lived alone for years and was known in the neighborhood for her eccentric behavior. After her death, the house had been sold, but none of the new owners had stayed for long. It was said that Margaret's spirit was still attached to her favorite doll, the very one that now sat in their living room. Desperate to rid themselves of the cursed doll, David and Jenna contacted a priest to perform a cleansing ritual. The priest warned them that some objects can carry the spirits of their former owners, especially those who had an unnatural attachment in life. The ritual seemed to work, and the disturbances stopped. But they weren't willing to take any more chances. The next day, they packed their things and moved out, leaving the doll behind in the empty house. Moral: objects from the past can carry more than just memories. Some things are better left untouched, for they may be bound to forces we cannot see. Always be wary of what you bring into your home, as not everything is as innocent as it seems. The world is full of things we cannot explain, and sometimes, the scariest stories are the ones that are true. Whether it's haunted houses, lingering spirits, or cursed objects, we must always remember that the supernatural world is closer than we think. Stay vigilant, for not all things that go bump in the night are a figment of our imagination.